All right, this is the story of Crocodile, Croco Boy, Crocodile, Mr. Zero. All right, Crocodile. He was born. He did what he had to do. He was at Roger's execution. All right, that's what I know. He saw Roger. The new pirate era was amongst them. He's a part of Shank's generation, right? So he's like, okay, you know, if I'm gonna become king of the pirates and go after this treasure, like everybody else, I have to fight the big dogs and make sure I fucking get them out of the way. I'm young, I'm inexperienced, but I can do it. You know, he ran up on Whitebeard. So he runs up on Whitebeard, and long story short, he gets his face cracked. Boom! And he can't take damage like Luffy now, and it's unknown if he had his dough fruit before or after. But I'll say that, either way, he still got his face cracked. And he needed stitches to stitch his face back together. That's why he had the stitches there. Luffy didn't give him those. That's what Whitebeard did. Didn't do that. Whitebeard did that to him. And then he was like, okay, I can't go after the One Piece. There's too many fucking big pirates going after that shit. I don't have what it takes to do something at that level. But I do have what it takes to go after um, the ancient weapons and then use my power to get and obtain whatever I want after that. You know, so he started a group called Baroque Works, and he was the agent in charge of that. Hence, Mr. Zero's his name. Um, he eventually then also became a warlord too, which granted him immunity from Marines. They didn't get to play games with his dick. That means they couldn't, take him in or anything because he's one of the seven warlords. He actually works for the government, as a privateer for the government, to catch other pirates. And that's what they call him to do it. Um, but he was playing games in the kingdom of Alabasta. See, that's where he knew about the Pluton. That's what he heard. Pluton was somewhere there. And he was like, okay, well, Pluton is somewhere in Alabasta. I have Nico Robin with me. She's my right hand woman. We're gonna take over this shit. We're gonna, take over this country and then have Pluton, and then everything else will fall into place, and we'll be powerful. I'll be powerful. He um, became. He got in good with the Nefertari family too. Certainly, you know, they were having a rebellion, right? In Alabasta because the king, took the water. But it was really Crocodile taking the water, But people saw Crocodile as a hero, putting down people of the rebellion and being like, the king is, crazy, I don't know why he's saying that, you people shouldn't have water or we can only give you so much water, from Alabarna. We have, you know, I have people and other things. I don't know. He's trying to take over Alabasta and everything. And it makes sense too because guess what? He's made of sand. He has a sand fruit. And Alabasta is a sandy kingdom, kind of like, Egypt and, places like that, you know. And he was like, I have to take over, and he had his Brokeworth agents. Then, Luffy comes to the island, right? When Luffy comes to the island, Crocodile already knew that Luffy was showing up because of his informants. Mr. Five, you know, welcomed them basically. Not just Mr. Five, Mr. Eight, which was Igaram undercover, and also Vivi, who was undercover in the Brokeworth agency. He actually knew that there were some people, trying to find his dick. That being Vivi and him. And then he also found out that the Straw Hats were on his dick too. He held Goldino to try to handle that shit. He didn't handle it. So then, they had to, you know, gather together in, rain dinners, trap them there, you know. At rain dinners, they got trapped. The Straw Hats got trapped. And Crocodile was like, well, after this, because Koza, the leader of the rebel army in Alabasta was, on his way. And he was like, okay, Koza's coming with all his people, we have royal army. The royal army's already gonna, fight against him because he has, the king has to defend his kingdom and the, Nefertari bloodline and all that. He incited the whole thing, the civil war. He got these people to hate the king and everything else. And then he had his Baroque works agents on both sides, killing, other people from Alabasta, basically, inciting the war, making it happen, making that shit, just starting fucking problems in that kingdom. And he was happy about it. Vivi tried to cut his head off, but she found out that, his head's made of sand. So then she was like, damn, I can't do it. Luffy eventually got free because of Sanji. And then Crocodile fought Luffy. See, when Luffy fought against Crocodile, um, if Luffy was a side character, I love Luffy too, but he probably would have died. Because Luffy, was at a disadvantage. He hadn't fought against but Smoker. Smoker, is a Logia user too. But Crocodile was a little bit better than Smoker at using his Del Fruit. And he he had the environment as his, to his advantage too. However, Luffy learned during this fight a little bit. Um, Crocodile, took the moisture out of his arm, and he also, is made of sand. Sand, solidifies in water. So when Crocodile went to Alabarna to take over, he, had the king pinned up against the wall, and he was like, your kingdom's mine now. This whole thing was for me to take over, and now everything that's left will be mine. Everything. And you have nothing, you can't do shit about it. Because he was like, Straw Hat Luffy's been taken care of and shit, and, there's nobody else. Your guards are weak as fuck. The people who are protecting you can't protect you. But then Pell showed up with Luffy, and Luffy was creative, and he was like, thinking, actually. He was like, okay, sand solidifies in the water, so I'll be Water Boy, Water Luffy. If you watch my Luffy Alabasta video and look at the thumbnail, that's what he did. Um, Water Luffy, and he was hitting Crocodile, he was able to hit Crocodile. Crocodile was surprised, but Crocodile had another move up his sleeve. See, Crocodile could use his hand and be like, take all the moisture out of, everything, you know, basically turning it to dust. And then he did it to Luffy too. And Luffy dried up like bone. And he was almost dead again. He got lucky. The water went up in the air and the water came down to hit him to revitalize him and, rehydrate him. And then he was on his way to the tunnel. But Crocodile went to the tunnel because Nico Robin had to read a poneglyph. And he was like, bitch, you gotta read this poneglyph. Where's Pluton at? We came here for this. And she's like, well, it ain't here. And he was like, what? I went through all the trouble to take over this country. And, you're telling me it's not here? He got mad and he, hurt Nico Robin, threw that bitch down, cut that bitch. And then Luffy got there and they had their final battle, which Crocodile lost. He got punched through the bedrock. And he, after he, was defeated, it rained in Alabasta, and it was a great day for them, but not for Crocodile. He got grabbed up by Smoker, and then he went to Impel Down, and he was there for a while, and magically, or by whatever fate or whatever it may be, Crocodile was there and Impel Down, and Luffy was there, and he was like, hey, Straw Hat, it's been a while, huh? Let me out too. Let me out. I can help you out in this war. I'd rather help a pirate out than help these, Marines and other people. Crocodile, was trying to go after Whitebeard, because Whitebeard had fucked with him, but then he was like, I guess I can't even fight him. He was fighting other people at Marineford. He had a clash with Mihawk, Doflamingo. He had to stop Akainu from touching Luffy at Marineford, to get him out of there. He was like, get Luffy out of here, you know. I usually don't help people out, but I'll do it here. Because during that war, it's either he's on the side of the other 7 warlords who still he calls to having their title, but he got his title stripped away, so he was a pirate. He didn't care anymore. And they were like, you know, you're weak and other things, but he was like, no, I'm actually doing what I'm supposed to as a pirate, you know. And he took care of that situation. And then after that, he went into hiding again. And then the wild thing, you know, he shows up again. But it's after, you know, all the warlords get their titles stripped from them because they don't need the warlords no more. They have other things called seraphim. These things who have devil fruit, you know, blood, Lemurian DNA, and they're clones of all the 7 warlords. Even he has a clone. But he met Mihawk and was like, you know, they're hunting our dicks now because we're now pirates again. His bounty went from 80 million to, man, 1 point something, I think 1.8, you know, billion. You know, a high jump in, you know, bounty for Crocodile. Yeah. Um, and not just him, but all the other ones too. They all got their bounties went way the fuck up. And then they were like, you know, they made an alliance with Buggy. Really, you know, Buggy needed their power, you know, and you know somebody in his crew got the bright idea to put Buggy's head as the main face of Cross Guild, with Crocodile and Mihawk on his side. So then they made, you know, the deal that, you know, since Buggy is the face of, you know, Cross Guild, they'll be off of our dicks a little bit. See, because Buggy has a lot of, you know, clout around his name, like a lot. And they were like, okay, he's one of the 7 warlords and he's our captain, but not really. You know, if he plays games, we can, you know, fuck his ass up. And, you know, Buggy's not the most powerful guy. Well, he is powerful, but he's not, you know, the strongest, the smartest, the fastest. You know, it's more of his influence and who he knew and what he knows from his experiences, you know, as a pirate, you know, and how he presents himself at certain times. And that's how he got what he needed. But, you know, Crocodile is there now. See, Crocodile is a part of Cross Guild. You know, what does that mean? You know, he's going to fight for Buggy. He's going to be on his team and help him out. Be a guard dog for him, essentially. Almost like his third, or no, not his third commander, but his second commander. First commander is the vice captain. That would be Mihawk. But that's Crocodile and his backstory. You know, what's gonna happen to Crocodile? Is he gonna get caught? Is he gonna die? Is he gonna fight against, you know, the Marines? Or is he gonna fight against, you know, Holy Knights? Who knows? Crocodile, that's the story of Crocodile. You know, one of the 7 warlords. You know, I have other videos coming out. Story times. But stay cool, call in the corner.